27 years ago, a young finance worker left the building where she worked one evening and vanished without a trace, leaving her family and the entire city of Harrisburg gripped by confusion. Authorities suspected people who had been seen around her that night, but with no body found, no clear witnesses, and only very few reliable leads, the investigation quickly stalled. Yet throughout all those long years, there were people who never gave up, clinging to the fragile hope that the truth was still somewhere among the mistakes and gaps of the late 1990s investigation. Then, during what seemed like a hopeless file review, one tiny forgotten detail suddenly opened an entirely new path, a detail powerful enough to turn the whole case upside down and force everyone involved to face a truth no one had ever imagined. Before we dive into this deeply shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys like this in pursuit of justice, don't forget to hit subscribe. An early autumn evening in Harrisburg spread a cold layer of air over the streets, making every movement feel slower. The city had just shaken off the end-of-day bustle. Shop lights dimmed, lines of cars thinned out, leaving long stretches of quiet at every intersection. Thin mist drifted lightly across the pavement, wrapping around the pale yellow street lamps and bending their light into hazy halos. Elena Marquez stepped out of the building where she worked, her white ID badge still hanging around her neck, shoulders slightly slumped from fatigue after the evening shift. She pulled her coat tighter as a cold gust rushed out from the gap between two buildings, carrying the damp smell of the Susquehanna River straight into her face. When the glass door closed behind her, Elena noticed the stillness felt unusually heavy. The street lamp nearby flickered once, as though the wiring was about to fail, creating an irritating break in the pool of light. In the distance came a sound like footsteps on concrete. The rhythm was uneven, sometimes clear, sometimes faint, as though someone was adjusting their pace to avoid drawing attention. Elena looked around but saw only the silhouettes of scattered parked cars, tree trunks stretching into long dark streaks, and the deep shadows connecting the parking area to the road leading out to the main street. No faces appeared, no voices talking, no engines running. She took a sharp breath, trying to stay calm, and walked toward the more secluded section of the parking lot. Each step echoed on the water-streaked concrete short, sharp sounds that bounced back into the already oppressive quiet. As she passed the first row of cars, Elena noticed a dark sedan parked crookedly outside the lines. Its windows were thick with condensation, making it impossible to see whether anyone was inside. The presence of the car made her hesitate for a moment, but then she quickened her pace, avoiding another glance so she wouldn't scare herself unnecessarily. The wind grew stronger, whipping her hair across her face and forcing her to raise a hand to push it back. The path down to the row where she usually parked was noticeably darker than the other areas. A long tree shadow stretched across the pavement, blocking almost all the light from the last two street lamps. Elena pulled the strap of her bag close to her body, lowered her head, and walked down the slight incline, leaning slightly forward against the wind. The sounds of the city seemed to vanish completely as she descended into that dip. No more traffic noise from the main road, no rustling wind, only the steady but somehow heavier than usual sound of her own heels. The atmosphere gave Elena the feeling that someone was watching every movement she made. As she moved deeper between the two rows of cars, the faint light from the final street lamp cast a narrow strip across the pavement. Elena stepped into that patch of light, her hair lifted lightly by the wind, her shadow stretching long behind her. After that moment, no one ever saw Elena again. At home, her family began to worry as the usual time she got off work passed and Elena still hadn't returned. Repeated calls went straight to silence. No reply messages, no sign of contact at all. Initial concern quickly turned to panic when Elena's phone stayed off. The family tried contacting coworkers, but no one knew where Elena had gone or why she hadn't come home. When the clock hands moved past the familiar time Elena was always home by, the whole family realized they had no other way to find answers. In a state of alarm, they called the police and reported that Elena Marquez was missing. When the family's call about Elena was transferred to dispatch, a patrol team near the riverfront area was immediately dispatched to the parking lot where she was last believed to have been seen. Flashlights swept across the pavement, still holding a thin layer of mist, moving through the dark gaps between rows of cars. The cold, still air made every movement sound sharper. Even the sound of police shoes stepping on the concrete rang out crisp and echoed back through the empty spaces of the deserted parking lot. The two officers split up to check the area, shining lights through the dew-covered gaps between vehicles, looking for any sign of anything unusual. They did not find Elena, nor did they see any clear signs of disturbance or collision. One of them contacted the building's security guard to gather information. The guard on the night shift seemed confused when asked about the last time he saw Elena. He recalled the image of the young woman hurrying out the main door, pulling her coat tightly around herself, but he had not paid attention to whether she was with anyone. He only remembered that the flickering lights at the time made him think the shadow behind Elena was caused by the lighting, not a real person. His account did not provide strong confirmation but suggested the possibility that someone had appeared with Elena at a critical moment. Police continued searching for residents living in the surrounding area. A woman who lived in a nearby building said that before closing her window, she had briefly seen two figures walking toward the parking lot. She was not sure if one was Elena because of the distance and dim light, but the silhouette of one of them seemed to belong to a woman, and the other was slightly taller. When asked for more details, she admitted she could not distinguish any other features except that one person was carrying a bag shaped like a work briefcase. This information caused the officers to begin considering that Elena had not left alone and may have been accompanied by someone. Police returned to the building where Elena worked to trace the final route she might have taken. They followed the hallway leading to the main exit, crossed the front porch area, then went down the small ramp connecting to the parking lot, the same path Elena took every day. Streetlights cast down onto the water-streaked concrete surface, creating faint, flickering spots of light that highlighted the mist slowly creeping across the pavement. The area had many blind corners and just enough dense foliage to block visibility if someone paused there for a moment. One officer noted that this was a location where it would be easy to approach a pedestrian without being detected. They compared the statements to reconstruct Elena's movements in the minutes before she disappeared. According to her night shift co-worker, Elena left the building alone and did not appear worried or confused. According to the security guard, the dim lighting and the shadow behind Elena were noteworthy but unclear. According to the local resident, two figures were moving in the same direction. These pieces of information aligned on one point. Elena had not moved randomly, she appeared to be walking with or beside someone else. When reconstructing the path, police marked the area with the weakest lighting where Elena disappeared from the camera's view and where the report of two figures was also noted. A narrow space between two rows of cars, just enough to conceal a quick approach, became the focal point of attention. After compiling all the initial facts, the investigation team reached a unified assessment that this was not a situation in which an adult had voluntarily left on her own. There were clear signs of coercive action. Elena had left the building in a normal state, with no reason to suggest she disappeared willingly. The presence of someone moving in the same direction as her, according to witness accounts, increased the likelihood that she had been led away or subdued. Based on direct observations at the scene, especially the areas with many blind spots and poor lighting conditions, police entered into the report that Elena Marquez had likely been approached by at least one person and may have been abducted for a specific purpose. The investigation team decided to expand the scope to gather additional statements and began examining any unusual activity in the area that night, treating it as a deliberate abduction. The patrol car's headlights swept across the quiet street as the officers continued to search the area around the building where Elena had left the previous evening. The night fog grew thicker, clinging to the road in a thin layer of mist that made each footprint leave a faint mark before quickly fading away. One officer paused when he spotted the tail end of a silver sedan peeking out from behind a large SUV. As they approached, the license plate confirmed it was indeed Elena Marquez's vehicle. The parking spot was several blocks away from where she normally parked, a distance that didn't match the habits described by her family and co-workers. This led the police to note signs of possible third-party interference. The sedan sat motionless, interior lights off, doors locked. The thick layer of condensation on the windows indicated the car had been there for a considerable amount of time, though not long enough to be covered in dust. From the outside, there were no signs of forced entry, no major scratches, no visible damage to the body. However, When they shone their flashlights inside, the excessive neatness caught their attention. Every visible item was in its proper place. There was not a single scrap of paper, purse, jacket, or any personal belongings typically found in the car of someone who worked the night shift. One officer angled his light toward the driver's seat. The seat was adjusted exactly to Elena's estimated height, not shifted even one notch, which matched the habit of someone who regularly drove the same car. When the beam moved to the back seat, the officers noticed an unusual depression in the cushion, slightly offset to one side, as though something heavy had been placed there, or someone had sat or lain in an unnatural position. An officer carefully opened the door with gloved hands after confirming there were no explosives or mechanical traps. The air inside still felt cold, despite the car having been off for a long time, carrying a faint mix of interior plastic and damp fabric. The dashboard was smooth and clean, no smudged fingerprints, no oily residue typically left by human hands. The door surfaces were the same, no identifiable prints at all. The glove compartment was gently opened and found nearly empty, except for a few irrelevant vehicle manual pages. An officer checked directly under the seats, but found no phone, wallet, or car keys. These three essential items that should have belonged to Elena were missing from every possible location. An absolute contradiction to the daily habits her family described, as Elena always carried her purse and usually kept a spare key in her jacket pocket. The floor of the car showed no large stains, no watermarks, no blood traces. The rubber mats under the driver's and passenger seats were clean, with only a few unavoidable tiny dust particles. On the rear floor there was a small amount of very fine, dark soil, not like the dirt in the parking area, which led the police to collect samples for analysis. Everything in the vehicle was excessively clean, prompting the more experienced officers to immediately note in their report that the car may have been driven by someone else, or at least superficially cleaned before it was discovered. One officer crouched to examine the ground beneath the vehicle. Under the right rear wheel was a faint soil compression mark shaped like a shoe that had stood still for quite some time. There was no clear direction of movement, just the impression that someone had stood waiting or performing some action next to the car. The officers measured and documented the approximate shape, though it wasn't sharp enough to identify the exact shoe pattern. Near the driver's door, a very thin line of dust had been swept slightly to one side, as though someone had lightly wiped the surface with a sleeve or cloth. Such small details rarely happen by chance in a low-traffic parking area late at night. While one group of officers continued searching for traces around the area, the others methodically checked the interior. The rear seat was examined closely and found to have a more pronounced sink in the cushion than the other seats, suggesting a weight impact possibly greater than that of a single adult. The rear seatbelt had also been extended beyond its usual length, as though it had been yanked hard or pulled out earlier, then returned to a position that didn't quite match the vehicle's standard length. This drew the police's attention because there was no logical reason for Elena to use the back seat right before she went missing. An officer checked the trunk. Inside, there was no suitcase, no storage box, no items belonging to Elena. The trunk mat was cleaner than normal for a car used daily, lacking the small scratches usually caused by shopping bags. A flashlight swept across the left rear corner of the trunk and revealed a small dark thread caught in a plastic seam, though its fabric type couldn't be identified yet. It was placed in a sealed evidence bag. The investigative team decided to tow the vehicle to the forensics center immediately. Before it was loaded onto the flatbed, they performed one final check to ensure no trace was missed on the road surface, the car body, or the driver's area. When the car was lifted, light revealed several additional patches of dark soil stuck near the rear axle, different from the soil in that location. More samples were collected for analysis. Once the vehicle was sealed and transported away, the team clearly documented in the report that the condition of Elena's sedan strongly indicated third-party interference. The parking location inconsistent with her habits, the excessively clean interior, the absence of personal items, the unusual marks on the rear seat, and the surrounding environment not matching the scenario of Elena leaving the vehicle on her own. From the moment it was found, the car became the central piece of evidence the police could use to trace back the time period leading up to Elena's disappearance. The search team began expanding their scope to the roads leading toward Riverfront Park after Elena's car was confirmed not to be in the area where she usually parked. From where the car was found, the direct path down to the riverbank was only a few blocks away, and this area had numerous waterfront trails connecting to the park. It was still dark, and the temperature had dropped sharply. Mist hung in the air, causing the flashlight beams to scatter into faint white dots. The search team moved in a line, fanning out in an arc formation to ensure no patch of ground that might hold signs of unusual movement was missed. While sweeping their lights over the layer of fallen leaves on the ground, one officer paused because he spotted a footprint pressed much deeper than the others in the area. The print was longer and wider than Elena's height and foot size, as reported by her family. The tread pattern was still quite clear, indicating it had been made not long before the police arrived. The direction of the footprint pointed straight down the trail toward the river, where the ground was wetter and more likely to hold impressions. Next to the first print, two more appeared. One of them slightly angled as though the person wearing the shoe had turned or was pulling something heavy that caused them to lose balance. This prompted the officers to focus their lights on the water's edge, where the soil was darker and softer. As they approached the riverbank, irregular drag marks in the fine soil suggested something had been pulled or dragged through. They weren't clear enough to definitively say it was a body being dragged, but the way the soil had been lightly furrowed in long lines led police to note the possibility of a vertical pulling force along the trail. Nearby, a small colored streak on some grass caught an officer's attention, and he bent down to examine it. The stain on the blades matched the color of the business shirt Elena had been wearing the night she disappeared. Upon closer inspection, they found a small scrap of fabric caught on the edge of a low, dry branch lying just above the ground. The scrap had fine weave threads, dark blue with a slight gray sheen, matching the family's description of the color of Elena's shirt. The fibers at the torn edge were ragged and uneven, as though the fabric had been stretched and then ripped rather than cut by a sharp object. This detail led the search team to record the hypothesis that there may have been a minor struggle or impact forceful enough to tear clothing. Riverfront Park has dense thickets mixed with small trees growing close together, creating pockets of darkness that flashlight beams struggle to penetrate. The search team called in additional K9 units to sweep the path from the parking area down to the riverbank. Once the dogs were released on leash, they began tracking along a certain distance before stopping at several points where the ground showed more obvious disturbance than elsewhere. One dog gave a short bark when nearing the area with the drag marks, but when led back and forth multiple times, it could not maintain a continuous scent. Another dog paused at a low patch of ground near the base of a large tree, sniffed intently at the soil, let out a low whine, then circled as though it had lost the trail. These behaviors were documented in the report because they indicated the presence of an unusual odor or movement trace, though not strong enough to lead to a specific discovery. The Susquehanna River stretched directly in front of the search team, its black surface reflecting distant pinpoints of light and creating a heavy atmosphere. The strong current along this section of the river made the search highly risky. When officers swept their lights close to the water's edge, they saw small whirlpools constantly spinning into one another, carrying leaves and floating debris down from upstream. One officer tossed a stick into the shallows and watched it get swept away very quickly, showing that anything that fell into the river would have little chance of remaining near the bank. The fast flow and uneven depth forced the search team to bring in additional personnel to probe with long poles and small boats. Beyond the water's edge, the team continued checking trail sections that intersected with the path to the river. A few areas showed unusually compressed soil, but there weren't enough marks to clearly identify anything. Patches of fallen leaves and thin mud made determining the exact direction of travel difficult. Yet the presence of a footprint that did not belong to Elena, together with the scrap of fabric matching her shirt color, created a clearer picture of at least two people being present around the time she went missing. While collecting details, the investigative team separately noted points that could indicate forced movement. On site, the officers discussed that the footprints leading toward the water and the torn fabric scrap were two elements that could not be ignored. Both suggested that Elena may have been brought to this area against her will. The K9 units did not locate a body or large submerged object, but their reactions at certain spots indicated the presence of human scent in locations that did not align with normal walking paths. Light from the opposite bank reflected into the dark stretch of river. Strong wind rippled the surface. The search team focused on the area near the trail, continuing to carefully check every bush and every patch of disturbed ground. The silence of the area, broken only by the soft lapping of water against the shore and the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, made many officers tense. With the discovery of an unfamiliar footprint, a torn piece of fabric, and the scattered scent alerts from the dogs, the investigative team recorded the possibility that Elena had been forced to leave the parking area and taken down to the riverbank area in the short time after leaving the building. These observations caused police to begin suspecting that Elena's situation may have moved beyond the scope of an ordinary missing person case. Although there was still no evidence confirming the worst outcome, the officers returned to the parking area with the goal of extracting all data from the building's security camera system and any recording devices installed in the surrounding vicinity. The technology of the late 1990s was not as advanced as later systems, but it was sufficient to capture the shape of people moving within the narrow pool of light in front of the building entrance. In the security room, the old monitor displayed repeating black and white frames in a continuous loop. One officer plugged in a device to back up the data while the guard searched for the logbook to determine the most recent time the cameras had been checked. When they opened the footage covering the time Elena left the building, the anomaly appeared right at the timestamp. The clock displayed in the video was 12 minutes behind the standard clock the police used for time synchronization. This forced the officers to recheck the entire date and time settings of the system. The guard confirmed there was no reason for the camera clock to drift like that in such a short period, as the previous shift had reported no errors. The 12-minute discrepancy drew the investigators' attention because it was large enough to throw off the entire sequence of events during the window when Elena disappeared. They watched the footage of the pitch-black parking lot, where light from the lampposts fell onto the pavement in faint streaks. When the moment arrived for Elena to step out the main door, her image appeared clearly through the black and white noise. She walked quickly, both hands gripping the straps of her bag tightly, head slightly tilted as though listening for something. What stood out was not Elena's footsteps, but the shadow of a figure that appeared behind her just a few seconds later. This figure was taller than Elena, but not excessively so, moving cautiously and maintaining just enough distance to stay out of the brightest areas of light. One officer zoomed in on the image to analyze the height ratio against the lampposts and the edge of the door. When compared to data from the list of people who had contact with Elena that evening, no one matched the height of the figure in the video. The night shift co-workers were not that tall. The person who caused trouble on the bus had a significantly different height, and Helton, the one who had previously clashed with Elena, was noticeably taller than the person shown in the footage. The fact that the image revealed a figure who did not match anyone previously identified caused the investigative team to pause and review the frames in slow motion. One officer questioned why this particular camera had a time discrepancy, while the other cameras on the same system remained synchronized correctly. This was verified by cross-checking the 4 cameras positioned around the building. 3 were unaffected. Only the one pointed toward the parking area was off. The settings interface showed that the time had been manually adjusted during a window that did not overlap with any security guard's shift. This led the investigators to lean toward the possibility that someone had deliberately tampered with the system. Accessing the parking lot camera was not complicated for anyone who knew how to take advantage of low-traffic moments, especially on quiet evenings with few staff present. The investigators needed to reconstruct the timeline using accurate data. If the camera was 12 minutes slow, the actual moment Elena stepped out of the building was completely different from the displayed time. This required the team to log every timestamp in the video and then add back the offset to rebuild the sequence. When they did so, they realized that the period during which Elena entered the parking area coincided exactly with the time one of the witnesses reported hearing voices near the path leading down to the park. The technical team reviewed the subsequent footage as Elena moved toward the edge of the lit area. The figure behind her continued to maintain distance, neither speeding up nor slowing down, seemingly observing every step she took. At one moment, the figure shifted slightly to the left as though to avoid a direct beam of light hitting their face. The officers noted this behavior because it demonstrated a deliberate effort to keep their face out of the camera's illuminated zone. The image was not clear enough to determine gender, but the movements indicated that the person had good control over their gait and was well aware of the camera's capture angles. Reviewing the frames again, the investigative team realized there was a dark zone right before the slope down to the parking area that the camera could not cover. This blind spot lay between two lampposts positioned slightly out of alignment, creating an unsupervised stretch more than 10 meters long. This was the exact location where Elena disappeared from view after passing through the final pool of light. The officers clearly documented this area as a camera dead zone, a place where someone could approach or overpower her without being recorded. The investigative team considered the possibility that the person appearing in the video knew about this dead zone. One officer pointed out that anyone approaching would need a certain level of knowledge about the camera layout and lighting in the parking area. The combination of maintaining distance from Elena, the effort to avoid direct light, and the purposeful gait raised the hypothesis that this individual may have worked in the building at some point or was at least familiar with the security equipment layout there. As the frames were rewound and replayed to capture every small detail, the investigative team continued to focus on why only one camera had its time altered. Manually adjusting the time required entering an access code or using the control panel located right behind the security room. Setting the clock back 12 minutes could erase the overlap between Elena's footsteps and the person following her in footage from neighboring street cameras. This discrepancy was enough to scramble the sequence of events and reduce accuracy when cross-referencing witness statements. The video was backed up in multiple copies for analysis, with each relevant frame marked to pinpoint the moment Elena was lost from sight. Locating the unmonitored dark area became the central focus of the work session, as it was the space most likely to have hosted any contact between Elena and the figure trailing behind her. These observations confirmed that the person in the video had followed her in a controlled manner, with specific knowledge of the camera angles, lighting, and surveillance capabilities of the parking lot camera system. The investigators shifted their focus to individuals who had direct contact with Elena on the day she disappeared. 3 names came up most frequently in the initial reports: a night shift coworker, a disruptive passenger Elena had recently dealt with, and Mark Helton, the IT technician who worked in the same agency as her. None of them were considered dangerous individuals, but each had some level of conflict with Elena in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. These conflicts were not major, but they were significant enough for the police to place all 3 on the first list for review. The first person contacted was Elena's night shift coworker, who had worked alongside her during the afternoon before she left the building, Colton Tanton. The woman stated that Elena seemed preoccupied with something, though she didn't specify what it was. They had a brief exchange about some internal audit items, but the conversation was normal. When asked about any conflict, she admitted there had been a minor argument a few days earlier regarding the division of responsibilities within the team. The incident wasn't serious, but it was enough to make Elena express dissatisfaction. The co-worker insisted she left the building quite a bit earlier than Elena and went straight home, but her alibi could not be immediately confirmed because she had been alone during the time Elena left the building. The second person was a disruptive passenger from a trip Elena had handled inspection for a few weeks earlier. Elena's job involved managing the ticketing system and passenger data, so she occasionally had to deal with irregular cases. According to an old report, the man had raised his voice at Elena after being asked to present identification. He became angry, feeling harassed, and used insulting language. When summoned, he denied any involvement in Elena's disappearance. The alibi he provided was that he had been at a bar with some acquaintances. However, verifying the alibi proved difficult because the witnesses present at the bar did not recall exactly when he left, and the bar's camera system did not have clear footage for the time frame under review. The third person, Mark Helton, received more attention due to internal information the investigators uncovered. Helton worked in the technical department and had access to the data systems Elena had been auditing recently. When questioned, Helton said that on the day Elena disappeared, he stayed late at the office to check servers. However, when asked specifically about the time he left the building and his route, Helton answered slowly and evasively. His demeanor was not tense, but he showed signs of avoiding eye contact when Elena's name came up. This led investigators to note in the record that Helton's reaction was not consistent with someone completely confident in his alibi. During the document review, one investigator discovered an internal complaint report that Elena had filed a few months earlier. The report showed that Elena had accused Helton of accessing certain data files for purposes outside his job responsibilities. The complaint did not result in serious discipline, but Helton was required to adjust his access permissions. Although there was no evidence that the incident created major conflict between the two, the fact that Elena had formally complained about a co-worker's improper conduct was considered a noteworthy point when evaluating possible motives. All three individuals were asked to provide their schedules for the evening Elena went missing. Although each had their own account to support their alibi, none had immediate, solid proof to rule them out of suspicion. The night shift co-worker had no direct witnesses. The disruptive passenger relied on vague statements from people at the bar. Helton had no one to confirm that he left the building at the time he claimed. This meant the investigative team could not eliminate anyone at this stage. One investigator paid close attention to Helton's behavior during questioning. When asked about his work and his relationship with Elena, Helton answered fully but occasionally hesitated, especially when the complaint incident was mentioned. Although his attitude did not cross the line of non-cooperation, Helton's cautious manner was noted as a significant observation in the investigator's working notes. Additionally, the way he interlaced his fingers and looked down at the table whenever questions turned to the time he left the building made the interview harder to assess. The investigative team needed to take further steps to verify what they had heard. They contacted the Human Resources Department to recheck Helton's duty logs and system access records for the weeks leading up to Elena's disappearance. The records showed that Helton had login rights to the servers Elena commonly used for data checks, during the same period when she had noticed small, unresolved discrepancies. Although there was no incriminating evidence against Helton at this point, the connection between his work and Elena's work caused the team to focus on him more than the other two persons of interest. Reviewing all three individuals at the same time helped the investigators build an initial picture of the network around Elena. The three came from different groups, had different types of contact and purposes with Elena, but each had some reason to create tension with her in the recent period. The officers recognized that they needed to keep a closer watch on Helton. The details related to his work, data access privileges, and his reactions during questioning caused him to be placed on the investigative team's long-term watch list for cross-referencing with any evidence collected. While reviewing old records to identify any details that might have been overlooked, an investigator found a file stored in the homicide team's steel cabinet containing documents from the time Elena disappeared. The pages had yellowed over time, the metal clips were oxidized, and the ink on some lines had faded slightly. When flipping to the section of the report concerning the initial search area, one detail caught his attention. The description of the shoe print location recorded in the log did not match the location circled on the map. On the 1998 map, the shoe print was marked in an area about 20 meters north of the Riverside Trail. However, the accompanying report described the shoe print as being right next to the path leading down near the water's edge. This difference was not just a matter of a few steps, it was a complete shift to an entirely different area that had not been thoroughly checked at the time. The investigator placed the two documents side by side, examining each descriptive detail and cross-referencing them with an updated terrain map. If this discrepancy was accurate, it meant the 1998 search team may have failed to examine a piece of ground that held strong potential for the possibility that the perpetrator had dragged or forced Elena to move. Upon discovering this contradiction, the investigator called a colleague over to compare notes. Both of them aligned the map symbols with the written description in the report. The reference number marked on the map did not correspond to the description written in the report, as though someone had written it incorrectly or copied it from a different diagram without verifying its accuracy. A note next to the map stated that the area had been excluded from the search because the shoe print was believed to be far from the trail and inconsistent with the direction a coerced person would move. Now, looking back at the mismatch between the actual location and the marked location on the map, they realized this was one of the key reasons the direction of the search had been wrongly narrowed. Beyond the location issue, the original report also noted that the shoe print sample had not been compared against the agency's internal database, particularly the list of maintenance staff and IT personnel, who often wore specialized non-slip footwear. The investigator questioned why this comparison had not been done, even though the original photograph of the print showed a quite distinctive tread pattern. When they re-examined the photo of the shoe print in the file, they saw deep, V-shaped grooves crisscrossing each other, not like common athletic shoes, but more like footwear used in dusty, greasy environments. This prompted them to compare it against the types of shoes issued at that time. While checking the equipment issuance list, a familiar name appeared to the investigative team: Mark Helton. The record showed that he had been issued a pair of maintenance-grade non-slip shoes while assisting the server repair department for a period. Although Helton did not regularly perform maintenance work, he had access to the technical areas and was provided with equipment identical to that given to full-time staff. The type of shoe listed in the issuance record had a sole pattern very similar to the one captured in the photograph. The investigator rechecked the shoe print photo and enlarged the tread section. After comparing it with illustrations from that year's equipment catalog, the proportions of the grooves appeared quite similar. Although absolute confirmation could not be made from the old images alone, this coincidence was documented in the updated report. Previously, Helton had been questioned about his alibi but had not been considered a primary suspect. However, the possibility that the shoe print matched the type he had been issued became a noteworthy detail during this case file review. Besides Helton, several other maintenance workers from that period had also been issued the same type of shoe. However, the list showed that they all worked fixed shifts and had confirmed alibis at verifiable locations during the time Elena disappeared. This significantly narrowed the scope, making Helton the only person on the matching shoe list without a completely clear and solid alibi. The investigator noted that this needed verification by locating any remaining physical evidence or traces. When cross-referencing the documents again, the investigative team recorded that the error in marking the shoe print location may have caused the entire initial search strategy to veer off course. The patch of ground that should have been thoroughly checked was overlooked simply because the map marked the wrong spot. This affected evidence collection, especially if that area once contained traces leading to where the perpetrator had been. One officer considered using current technology to reanalyze or reconstruct the shoe print from the original photographs. Although the quality of the old images was not high, the investigative team believed additional data on sole size and direction of movement could still be extracted to determine the depth of the impression. If complete enough, this information could strengthen the link between the shoe print and certain individuals who had access to the area where Elena worked. Even though nothing could be definitively confirmed right away, the investigative team acknowledged that this was the first time they had seen details in the old files that potentially held far more significance than initially assessed, especially given the distinctive tread pattern and the limited number of people who would have owned such shoes. This information was forwarded to the forensics group for more detailed analysis using modern technology to identify the exact shoe model and to cross-reference it with the agency's issued equipment list. This process allowed them to refocus scrutiny on the footwear associated with Helton and anyone else who had contact with the technical areas around the time Elena went missing. The following months passed in the usual slow pace of an investigation that couldn't find a solid foothold. The investigative team kept trying to verify the leads they had gathered, but every check ran into the limits of the evidence. The shoe impression wasn't sharp enough to trace back to the exact owner. The camera footage was time-shifted but couldn't prove who had tampered with it. The torn piece of fabric had been heavily affected by wind and weather, so forensic examination could only confirm the material. The disturbed marks near the riverbank were no longer clear enough to draw a precise conclusion. All of this left the entire team in the familiar state of deadlock that comes with missing persons cases, lacking witnesses, and direct physical evidence. They filed updated reports, but no piece of data carried enough weight to justify an arrest. In numerous internal meetings, the investigators debated which direction the investigation should focus on. Some still leaned toward the possibility that Elena had left the building while being led or forced, based on the figure that appeared in the camera footage. Others argued she might have voluntarily met someone without telling anyone. No matter which hypothesis was raised, every direction faced serious limitations due to the lack of strong physical evidence and the absence of direct witnesses. The individuals who had been considered initial persons of interest could not be charged because of insufficient forensic data, and all of them had provided statements that could not be immediately disproven. The investigative team's file cabinet grew heavier with more reports, photographs, notes, and interview transcripts, but quantity did not create progress. The lead investigator on the case repeatedly reviewed surveillance video and crime scene photos, hoping some detail in the small elements had been overlooked. This work happened quietly in the dimly lit office, where old cardboard tubes and rolled topographic maps lay stretched across the desk. But every time they reopened the file, they found the same conclusions repeating over and over, with no additional link to connect to what was already known. Elena's family kept calling the police headquarters, asking about any update, even the smallest one. Each time they received a call, the assigned officer had to explain that the process was still ongoing but there was no new information. They always kept their tone calm, but the reality was that the family's anxiety gradually turned into an exhausting weariness. The calls became less frequent, but each one still carried hope that the investigative team could not fulfill. Evidence related to Elena was gradually transferred from the temporary analysis room to the police evidence storage. Every item was sealed in a specialized evidence bag, assigned its own case number, and placed into cold metal cabinets. The fabric scrap, soil samples, video copies, crime scene photographs all lay still in a temperature-controlled environment. The evidence locker made no sound at all. Only a heavy silence surrounded it. Those items sat there like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together, offering no clear path forward. As time passed, the investigative team faced another obstacle. Some of the original investigators retired or transferred to other units. New personnel who took over the file had to read through hundreds of pages of reports, trying to understand every step that had been taken and every decision that had been made. The file changed hands multiple times, so the continuity in evaluating events was no longer intact. Each investigator reread it in their own way, leading to different priorities and difficulty in agreeing on which details to focus on. At times, small inconsistencies in the file, for example, a location description that didn't perfectly match between the map and a statement, consumed a lot of analysis time but produced no significant result. Forensic technology at that time was not advanced enough to fully exploit the remaining traces. Soil samples from the car and the scene were not deeply analyzed for mineral composition comparison. The ability to examine faint fingerprints was still limited. DNA analysis equipment was not sensitive enough to process low-quality or heavily contaminated samples. These limitations caused many potentially important leads to be set aside or left unprocessed. In that context, shoe comparison, camera analysis, and behavior assessment all remained at the level of speculation that was not strong enough to build a prosecutable case. While the police struggled with these constraints, the lives of those who had once been on the initial suspect list continued as normal. The night shift coworker kept working her regular shifts without special monitoring. The disruptive passenger continued to come and go in the downtown area without facing any legal barriers. Helton continued working in the technical department, handling system repairs whenever requested. None of them had their movement restricted or faced close ongoing supervision beyond the interviews that had already taken place. The lack of evidence allowed all of them to live calmly, even though their names had once appeared in investigative reports. The prolonged lack of progress caused the case to gradually lose attention in the daily operational files of the investigative team. New cases with more urgent demands took up time and manpower. Elena's file remained on the shelf but was no longer opened regularly. Her name slowly disappeared from summary meetings, and periodic reviews brought no changes, causing the file to sink deeper into the pile of unsolved cases. Ultimately, Elena's disappearance was classified into the group of stalled files, lying dormant in the category of cases without resolution. The thick case folder was pushed into an iron cabinet alongside many other files, becoming one of the unsolved cases the police could not advance further at that time. When the cabinet door closed, the brief metallic sound echoed through the room, marking the moment the case was officially regarded as a cold case, a file with no further progress, yet still existing as an unanswered question in the storage system of the Harrisburg Police Department. In 2024, the Pennsylvania Department of Justice launched a new DNA testing program for cold cases more than 2 decades old. focusing on files that still had evidence preserved in original condition. Notifications were sent to police departments across the state, requiring them to review storage vaults to identify cases eligible for modern forensic techniques. When the list was compiled, Elena's file was placed in the priority group because many sealed evidence samples remained fully intact according to the old procedures. In the evidence storage room, boxes of physical evidence were placed on the examination table, each sealed plastic bag reflecting the white overhead lights through its transparent surface. The box containing evidence from Elena's disappearance case was opened with extreme care by the newly assigned forensic team overseeing the program. The lead forensic investigator, who had many years of experience handling backlogged cases, was now tasked with re-examining every item related to Elena to assess the feasibility of analysis using updated technology. Inside the box, the evidence was clearly categorized. One bag containing a hair strand found in the car, one bag with a torn piece of fabric, two small bags holding soil and soot samples collected from the Riverside area and under the vehicle, photographs of the shoe print, and paper documentation describing previous crime scene examinations. The stable storage conditions had prevented excessive degradation of the samples. The forensic investigator began inspecting each bag to determine which ones could be processed using the 2024 DNA analysis protocol. The forensic team noted that the hair strand from the car was one of the rare samples still retaining an intact root structure, the necessary condition for nuclear DNA extraction. Current technology can analyze extremely small amounts of DNA, even when long exposed to environmental contaminants. This opened the possibility of obtaining a complete DNA profile from the hair sample despite its collection more than 20 years earlier. The torn fabric was examined under specialized magnification and still showed traces of fine fibers that could be separated to search for skin cells or epithelial material. The soot and soil samples from under the car and the Riverside area could also provide information about mineral sources or organic molecules, helping identify where the evidence had been in contact. When reviewing the shoe print photographs, the forensic team used software to measure tread groove ratios and match the sole pattern to catalogs of footwear manufactured in the 1990s. Although DNA cannot be obtained from images, the degree of pattern correspondence could identify the specific shoe model, allowing cross-referencing with lists of owners or issued equipment. This level of precision had not been possible at the time the case first occurred, but in 2024, shoe sole pattern analysis software can reconstruct three-dimensional models from the original photographs. The newly assigned forensic investigator carefully read through the entire accompanying case file. He reviewed every line of the original descriptions, noting inconsistencies regarding the shoe print location and areas of ground that had never been properly searched. With years of experience handling long-stored evidence, he determined that reopening this case had solid scientific grounding if DNA analysis was conducted carefully. Critically, the hair and fabric samples were in better condition than anticipated, making DNA extraction realistically feasible. In the examination room, whiteboards were used to list each item: hair DNA, fabric surface DNA, soot mineral analysis, shoe print comparison. The forensic team sequenced the processing steps to prevent cross-contamination. Specialized equipment, next-generation DNA extraction machines, spectrophotometric scanners, and shoe impression analysis software was prepared and ready. The forensic investigator re-watched the old parking lot video to better understand the terrain and lighting conditions of the area. He confirmed that the remaining evidence had been collected accurately according to the protocols of the time, but modern technology now allowed much deeper exploitation of those same items. Details such as the soot under the car could be compared against samples from multiple locations to pinpoint contact sites. The torn fabric could be scanned for microtraces invisible to the naked eye. All of this represented a major advancement over the technical limitations that existed when the case first occurred. After completing the preliminary assessment, the forensic investigator submitted an internal report to command, clearly stating which evidence retained analytical value and held strong potential to yield critical data. The investigative team was notified that Elena's file would be placed in the priority processing group under the 2024 testing program because the samples fully met the technical requirements of the protocol. This gave the case an opportunity to be re-evaluated objectively and scientifically, using technologies that did not exist at the time of the original incident. In the laboratory, the forensic team began the DNA extraction process from the hair sample using the new kit. Simultaneously, the fabric piece was placed into a high-resolution scanner to separate fiber layers. The soil samples were processed through a mineral analyzer to determine specific composition. Another subgroup examined the shoe print photographs via computer modeling to measure sole dimensions and groove depth with significantly improved accuracy. With each processing step, the investigators documented the condition of every item in the analysis log. Each sample was time-stamped, assigned to a responsible person, and recorded with the exact method used to prevent any errors during handling. The 2024 forensic protocol demanded an extremely high level of precision to minimize the risk of cross-contamination or data loss. As analysis began, the investigative team formally recorded that Elena's case file was in suitable condition for re-examination, using the full range of available modern technology. For the first time in more than 2 decades, the matter was being advanced, with equipment powerful enough to process samples previously considered unworkable. Every action in the examination room was carried out with intense focus, because everyone understood that these long-preserved pieces of evidence might contain data that had never been decoded before. When the hair sample recovered from Elena's car was entered into the forensic system, the forensic team performed extraction using the latest nuclear DNA protocol, employing specific enzymes to maximize recovery of the genetic structure. The results displayed on the screen showed that the DNA in the hair belonged to an adult male. When the data was uploaded to CODIS for comparison, the system returned no matches, confirming that the man who left the hair in Elena's car was not in the list of previously considered suspects, nor was he in the state or federal criminal database. This was regarded as a key piece of information, adding weight to the assessment that someone else had been present in Elena's car on the night she disappeared. Since no results came from CODIS, the forensic team sent the data to Othram, a specialized laboratory for genealogical DNA analysis used in long unsolved cases. When the data was processed using kinship separation algorithms, a family tree appeared with multiple branches, one of which stood out due to a higher density of matches compared to the rest. This lineage carried the surname Morris and had family roots in the state of Ohio. 3 names emerged in the analysis results within the same close kinship group, showing a high genetic similarity to the recovered hair sample. When residence records were checked, all 3 had primarily lived in Ohio and surrounding areas throughout the 1990s, with no official address in Harrisburg at the time of Elena's disappearance. This prompted the forensic team to dig deeper into other branches of the Morris family to determine whether anyone might be connected to the area where Elena worked. One investigator rechecked personnel records from the human resources system of the agency where Elena worked in 1998. In the list of former employees, or those who had transferred departments, a name appeared: Sandra Morris, who had worked in the finance department during the same period Elena was auditing data. The surname Morris matched the genealogical branch identified by Othram, significantly raising the level of interest in the origin of the DNA sample found in Elena's car. Sandra had no criminal record and had been evaluated as responsible in her work, but the coincidence of her surname with the family tied to the collected DNA forced the investigative team to re-examine all of her relationships within the agency at that time. While reviewing archived documents, the investigator discovered that Sandra had been involved in monitoring internal transactions that Elena had been tasked with auditing. The two had exchanged communications multiple times regarding certain numerical discrepancies Elena had noted in the system. The appearance of the Morris surname in the genealogical data made this professional connection more noteworthy, suggesting the possibility that the hair in Elena's car had not come from a complete stranger, but from someone with an indirect link through the agency. The genealogical data from Othram showed that the hair did not belong to Sandra but could belong to a close relative of hers. This was clearly stated in the forensic report because the degree of match was not sufficient for a direct conclusion, only indicating a blood relationship. The presence of a man from the Morris branch in Elena's car raised the possibility that this individual had been in or around the vehicle at the time it was moved or tampered with, though the actual identity of that person remained unclear. Since none of the three Morris individuals had documented residences in Harrisburg, the investigative team needed to examine a broader range within the family tree to identify anyone who might have lived nearby, worked near Elena, or had reason to appear within the agency's operational area. While continuing to study old records, one investigator found data about an employee who had visited the building where Elena worked to assist with internal audits around the time of her disappearance. This person was a distant relative of Sandra Morris and had been present at meetings related to the analysis of numerical discrepancies. Although he did not work directly in the building, he had access to certain administrative areas to collect documents for the finance department. This allowed the investigative team to note the possibility that the hair sample could belong to someone providing support in the work and who had, at some point, been in contact with Elena or her vehicle. The investigators shifted their attention to Helton because the connection between the hair sample and the genealogical data showed an overlap between the Morris group and the technical department where Helton worked. In several earlier reports, Helton had collaborated with the finance department to resolve software issues. Personnel records also showed that Helton had worked on projects that involved Sandra and the audit team. The fact that the hair belonged to a man related by blood to the Morris family led the investigative team to record the hypothesis that this person may have assisted someone within the agency who could access Elena's information. When analyzing possible scenarios, the forensic team noted that the hair in the car did not merely indicate someone's presence, but could reflect a specific role in gaining access to Elena's vehicle. The person who left the hair may have entered the car under unclear circumstances or during the process of the vehicle being moved. The absence of heavy stains or major disturbance inside the car led investigators to consider that the access may have occurred briefly or under low-light conditions. The hair sample was reanalyzed to estimate the age of the person who left it. Certain biochemical markers indicated that the sample came from a man in the middle-aged group during the late 1990s. This age range did not match most of the younger employees who worked alongside Elena, causing the investigative team to narrow the focus to older individuals who had been present in the agency area. In this way, the genealogical data helped narrow the scope of the investigation to the Morris branch, while also creating an indirect link between that family and Helton, who had access to the data systems Elena was working on during the final period of her involvement. Once the genealogical comparison was completed, the report was added to the case file, clearly stating that the hair sample in Elena's car showed characteristics of a man related to the Morris family in Ohio. Although the specific identity had not yet been determined, the appearance of this family branch in the genealogical analysis helped the investigative team expand the list of individuals to be examined and verified. The analysis of the evidence using 2024 technology provided an additional direction for continuing the search for individuals potentially connected to Elena's disappearance, while also establishing a significant connection between the Morris group and Helton during the file review process. As the investigative team expanded the scope of checking Elena's professional connections, they began reviewing archived files from Capital Area Transit dating back to 1998, where Elena worked in the Financial Oversight Department. These documents were rescanned using digitization equipment for analysis. While going through each irregular transaction, the investigators discovered a prolonged series of discrepancies totaling more than $70,000 that had been adjusted out of the system in a way that was difficult to detect. These amounts were split into many small portions, scattered across numerous reports, making them only truly noticeable when aggregated using modern technology. In one internal memo, Elena had noted that she had detected suspicious discrepancies in transactions processed during the month prior to her disappearance. Her handwritten notes were preserved in the paper file, the handwriting even and precise, pointing out 3 groups of transactions that she assessed as not in accordance with standard procedure. The pen stroke stopped abruptly at the final line as though she had been in the middle of compiling the information. Markings on the page showed that Elena had reviewed each item meticulously, using her own symbols to classify transactions requiring further scrutiny. These symbols were clearly explained in the work guide that Elena had personally prepared for the department. When cross-referencing with the login system from that period, the investigative team found that only 2 individuals had permission to edit transactions in the groups Elena had flagged: Helton and Sandra Morris. Elena's access rights allowed her only to view data, not to alter figures. This made her discovery of the discrepancies a particularly noteworthy element in the file. The 1998 login records showed that several changes were made from accounts under Helton's and Sandra's authority, but the times and purposes were not described with sufficient detail, as the system at that time did not log each individual action as thoroughly as modern systems do. The investigators examined Elena's old work schedule, extracted from a tape backup preserved in storage. In that schedule, there was a note indicating she had arranged an informal meeting on the evening she disappeared. The meeting was scheduled at the end of the workday, with a brief entry, "Meet to discuss figures." No name of the other person was recorded, but the timing matched the moment Elena left the building. This suggested Elena may have agreed to meet someone to present the discrepancies she had uncovered. The investigative team confirmed that no official meeting had been scheduled in the internal calendar at that time, indicating the meeting was private in nature between her and one other individual. When re-examining the content in the 1998 accounting system, the investigative team found transactions that had been modified through overwriting a method used only when someone wanted to obscure traces on the old system. The overwritten data lines carried electronic signatures linked to two accounts, one belonging to Helton, one to Sandra. The changes occurred in 3 separate batches, each spaced 1 week apart. The 2024 forensic software enabled extraction of previously compressed logs, and these revealed that the funds had been routed through multiple temporary accounts before being consolidated into 2 main accounts outside the normal audit scope. Elena was the only person in the group assigned to review these overwritten data entries. In her handwritten notes, she had marked a series of transactions sharing the same modification pattern and underlined the names of the approving individuals. Although she did not explicitly state the purpose, the way she circled and grouped the number sequences showed that Elena had recognized repeated interference in the system occurring over several weeks before her disappearance. The investigators contacted the former finance department to determine whether the adjusted transactions had been handled according to procedure. The manager from that time confirmed that they had received no official notification of any major discrepancies and had not been informed that any employee was under review. This led the investigative team to note the possibility of unauthorized interference in the system to conceal illicit changes. When reviewing access rights again, the investigative team discovered that Helton had previously held permissions to install and troubleshoot software, including the ability to manipulate files related to transactions. Sandra, due to her position in internal accounting, had rights to adjust figures. Both individuals were part of the group with access to the exact data Elena was examining immediately before her disappearance. These factors caused the investigative team to mark financial motive as a central element. Numerous archived reports described Elena as someone who rarely overlooked errors. She kept careful records and always requested cross-verification whenever she noticed anomalies. This was clearly evident in the monitoring notes she wrote. Upon reviewing these records, the investigators noticed many instances where Elena had added symbols indicating she was preparing to report the discrepancies to higher management. Although no email or official notification about this existed, the handwriting and structure of the notes suggested she intended to present critical information. Synthesizing all the gathered data, the investigative team recorded that individuals capable of interfering with internal data belonged to a narrow group of people with deep knowledge of the software system, transaction structures, and approval processes. These people had access to the sensitive files Elena was reviewing right before she went missing. The complexity of the altered transactions indicated that the person responsible not only understood the data processing mechanism, but also knew how to disperse the funds to avoid rapid detection. Archived financial records showed that these discrepancies had been concealed through multiple layers of overriding behavior, inconsistent with system errors and inconsistent with accidental operations. When collecting all documents related to the manipulated amounts, the investigative team flagged this as one of the most important data groups in the file. Elena's disappearance was now being examined from a new perspective, in which financial motive played a central role. Individuals who had access and authority to adjust data at that time were placed on a list requiring thorough re-examination because they possessed both the ability to access the system and the in-depth understanding of how the transactions Elena found abnormal operated right before she vanished. The coal dust sample collected from the undercarriage of Elena's car was placed into the mineral spectral analyzer to determine its formation source. When the chart appeared on the screen, the forensic specialist noticed characteristic spectral bands of industrial coal mixed with oxidized metal impurities. The levels corresponded closely with a reference sample collected from the Harrisburg yard rail area, where many old containers were stored and seasonal cargo was staged. The analysis results showed that the dust in the car matched the dust at the rail yard, consistent with the possibility that the car had stopped or passed through this area at a time close to the night Elena disappeared. In the internal meeting, the investigators reviewed the map of the Harrisburg yard area. The rail yard was not far from where Elena worked, featuring many lightly traveled side tracks and layered terrain that included rusted containers, abandoned rail cars, and ground thickly covered in black coal dust. The investigative team marked locations that had been used as staging areas in the 1990s, since the yard's layout had changed over time. When reanalyzing images and maps, they identified 3 areas capable of retaining coal dust, matching the exact composition found under Elena's car. The search team was assigned to resurvey the rail yard, this time following a defined radius based on the analysis data. The investigators moved between old rail lines, observing soil and stone, checking small recesses behind containers, and carefully documenting points that might have once held human presence. The nature of the rail yard, with its uneven, bumpy terrain and multi-layered stacked containers, required the search to proceed slowly. Even though more than 2 decades had passed, some locations still retained a layer of coal dust, similar to the sample from Elena's car. While reviewing evidence items previously overlooked from the 1990s, one investigator found in the files an old sealed bag containing a very small fabric fiber fragment recovered from the roadside area leading into the rail yard. The fragment had not been analyzed at the time due to a lack of suitable technology. The forensic team placed this sample into the material scanner to identify the fiber structure. The results showed the fiber belonged to a type of synthetic fabric commonly used in maintenance uniforms during the late 1990s. Notably, the color and fiber structure matched the maintenance uniform that Helton had been issued when assisting the technical department. When reviewing the 1998 maintenance uniform images provided by Human Resources, the investigative team saw that the maintenance jacket was dark blue, woven from a friction-resistant synthetic fiber. The fabric fragment, recovered at the rail yard, showed similar characteristics in color, wear pattern, and weave. Although not sufficient to prove absolute origin, this coincidence was recorded in the forensic report as a point connecting to an individual who had access to technical equipment at the time of Elena's disappearance. The investigators compared this finding with the 1998 system access data. They discovered that Helton had visited the maintenance area to check network equipment in the week before Elena disappeared. This access permission allowed him to wear the maintenance uniform because he had to enter areas requiring protective gear. This information was entered into the file as an element to be considered alongside the financial data and professional connections among Helton, Sandra, and Elena. While surveying the rail yard, the investigative team noticed areas of unusual soil compaction right next to the eastern row of containers. Some spots had small indentations, possibly caused by a heavy object being placed there or by human movement in darkness. Although the marks were no longer intact, the soil structure at those points indicated strong prior impact, consistent with the hypothesis that someone had been present in the area close to the night Elena disappeared. The investigative team noted every point, took wide-angle photographs, measured the dimensions of the indentations, and collected additional soil samples for comparison. These combined results suggested the possibility that Elena had been brought to Harrisburg Yard for a period of time before her car was found at a different location. The distinctive coal dust on the car's undercarriage created a direct link between the vehicle and the rail yard, while the fiber matching Helton's maintenance uniform indicated the likelihood that someone wearing this type of uniform had been present in the area. The investigators recorded this in the report, stating clearly that the rail yard area matched many of the physical elements found in the car and on the previously overlooked fabric fragment. The investigative team continued expanding the inspection to abandoned containers at the rail yard. Some containers remained structurally intact despite heavily rusted surfaces. Inside, many of them were old scratch marks, peeling wall panels, and layers of coal dust mixed with metal dust. These observations could not confirm anything definitively, but the investigators noted that this was an environment capable of temporarily holding a person without easy detection. In the late 1990s, this area had few witnesses because commercial activity was minimal outside working hours. While collecting more dust samples, the forensic team noticed that some samples contained small dark blue fibers, similar in color to the fragment recovered earlier. This prompted them to group all the samples together for microfibers extraction processing. This allowed comparison of wear patterns, fiber density, and weave style with the maintenance uniforms from that period. The analysis data was entered into a summary table, showing multiple points of similarity between samples collected at the rail yard and the fabric issued to technical support personnel in 1998. From the collected data, the investigators noted that Harrisburg Yard exhibited many signs consistent with the evidence from Elena's car, the fiber sample, and factors related to individuals who had technical access privileges. This raised the importance of the area within the case file. The rail yard became one of the key locations for on-site re-examination based on forensic information, serving as a place where Elena may have appeared or been forced to go during the period of lost contact. When the information about reanalyzing the evidence was widely publicized in the Harrisburg community, an elderly man who had previously worked at the Harrisburg Yard rail yard approached the police department requesting to meet with an investigator. He stated that he had worked for many years in the rail yard area before retiring and had witnessed a haunting incident toward the end of the 1990s. He said he had never reported it to the police because he thought it was just a normal argument, but upon hearing that Elena's disappearance case was being reopened, he wanted to provide a statement because he felt the detail might be relevant. In the interview room, he was invited to sit down and take a sip of water before beginning to recount what he still remembered. He described that on one late fall evening in 1998, while on duty in the eastern container area, he heard arguing voices drifting from the direction of the old storage warehouse. The voices were carried intermittently by the wind, making the content unclear, but the volume was loud enough for him to recognize that people were engaged in a heated argument. A few seconds later, he heard a sound resembling a woman screaming loudly. He used the word horrified to describe the pitch, and said the sound lasted but was abruptly cut off as though it had been stifled. He described his immediate reaction as standing up from his chair and looking toward the warehouse. In the dim glow of the industrial lights, he saw the silhouette of a vehicle parked near the entrance to an old, disused warehouse. It was an older-style pickup truck, dark in color, with a long bed. When the investigators showed him multiple images of 1990s vehicle models, he immediately pointed to the Ford Ranger, stating that the vehicle he saw had a similar shape and size. His demeanor, while describing the vehicle, was quite confident. He clearly recalled the bed shape and the rear light design details he could confirm because he had worked near areas with many types of cargo transport vehicles. His identification of the vehicle model drew significant attention because the 1998 records showed that Helton owned a Ford Ranger during his time working at Capital Area Transit. In the old vehicle registration data, Helton's truck was listed as charcoal black, closely matching the witness's description. However, when the investigators asked if he had seen the driver, he said he did see someone step down from the cab. He furrowed his brow in recollection and affirmed that the person was a woman. He described a slender build, long hair tied back, walking quickly and decisively. According to him, the woman stepped out first and then opened the passenger side door, as though waiting for someone to emerge from the warehouse or from the shadows. He could not hear any words because of the distance, and because a freight train on the main track was passing at the same time, creating noise. When the investigators asked how many people appeared, he said he only clearly saw one woman and no one else, but the arguing sounds earlier indicated at least two people. Not seeing the second person left him confused during his observation, and because he briefly turned away to check his radio, he saw no figures when he looked back. He believed the truck remained parked in that spot when he checked again, but the cab door was now closed. The investigators asked many detailed questions about the woman's appearance. He said the lighting in the rail yard was poor, but he could confirm that the woman was of average height and not overly thin. Her clothing was in dark tones. He could not make out the exact style, but it looked more like office attire than work uniform. When asked if he could identify her face, he answered no, because the distance was too great, and the backlighting from the lamps cast her face in shadow. The investigative team documented this information and compared it with Sandra Morris's personnel photo from 1998. The build in the photo had many similarities to the witness's description. Average height, long hair tied back, a habit of wearing dark-toned clothing. Although this could not be considered positive identification evidence, the fact that the witness described a woman rather than a man caused the investigators to reconsider the initial assumption about who had approached Elena. When asked why he had not reported the incident at the time, the witness explained that arguments in the rail yard were not uncommon, especially among work crews who often disputed shift assignments or break times. He admitted the scream-like sound had haunted him, but since he did not witness any violence firsthand, he thought it was just a heated argument between two acquaintances. He left his shift shortly afterward, and the matter faded from memory until he heard that Elena's disappearance case was being re-examined. When cross-referencing the statement with the soot, fabric fiber, and shoe print analysis data, the investigative team noted every point of correspondence in detail. The witness's sighting of a Ford Ranger matching Helton's vehicle from that period was added to the file as an element requiring closer forensic and operational analysis. However, the information about a woman driving the vehicle opened a different line of evaluation, indicating that the truck may not necessarily have been driven by its owner on the night Elena disappeared. The investigators clearly recorded that the witness's statement reflected the presence of a woman in the rail yard area, consistent with many details related to Sandra in the 1998 personnel file. The investigative team recorded this statement as important supplementary data, providing another piece of the puzzle regarding human and vehicle movements in the rail yard around the time Elena went missing. The witness's descriptions of the sounds, the woman's build, the pickup truck, and the observed behavior at the scene helped the investigative team document possibilities that needed verification through subsequent forensic and investigative data. During a land survey conducted for the expansion of a road near the suburban area on the edge of Linglestown, the construction crew discovered an area of unusually sunken ground. When they dug into the topsoil, the unmistakable smell of decomposition immediately rose up, forcing the site supervisor to contact the police. The investigative team arrived at the scene and secured the area, setting stakes to mark the boundaries of the survey zone. Forensic technicians began excavating the soil very carefully, using specialized shovels to avoid damaging any evidence beneath the surface. Just a few minutes later, a small fragment of bone emerged from the damp earth. As they continued to widen the excavation area, they uncovered the skeletal structure of a human body lying in a shallow grave. The grave was no more than 1 meter wide and less than half a meter deep, indicating that the person who dug it had not spent much time excavating. The body lay on its side, with rib bones and arm bones exposed under the beam of specialized lighting. The surrounding soil still retained high moisture content, which had helped preserve some of the skeletal shape despite many years of decomposition. The forensic technicians used soft brushes to gently clean each small section, gradually revealing the rest of the remains. When the skull became clearly visible, the lead investigator immediately noted in the log that the skeletal structure was consistent with an adult female. The remains were placed into a body bag and transported to the examination lab. There, forensic specialists analyzed the bones to establish identity. They measured the length of the femur, examined the pelvic structure, and reviewed other anatomical features. Several clear indicators showed that this individual was in the same age range as Elena at the time of her disappearance. When dental records were compared, multiple points of correspondence appeared quickly, confirming that the body was Elena Marquez. This identification match was formally documented in the report prepared that same night. While examining the skull, the technician discovered a large fracture line running from the temporal region to the back of the head. The fracture showed the characteristic wide spread of blunt force trauma caused by a hard, non-sharp object, not the result of soil subsidence or post-burial cracking. The extent of the fracture and the bone break pattern indicated an impact force strong enough to cause death immediately, or within a very short time. There were no defensive marks on the forearm bones or hand bones, leading forensics to record that the blow likely occurred unexpectedly, leaving the victim no time to react. When examining the wrist and ankle areas, forensics found no signs of prolonged binding or restraint. There were no rope impressions on the bones, and the positioning of the body in the grave was consistent with the victim having been placed there shortly after death. These observations led the specialists to note in the report that the time of death and the time of burial were not far apart. The way the body was positioned also suggested that the person who buried her acted quickly, without attending to many details, possibly due to fear of being seen or discovered. While sifting through the soil surrounding the body, the technician discovered an unusual fabric fiber lying close to the rib bones. The small fiber, dark brown in color, was removed with specialized tweezers and placed into an evidence bag. Under magnification, the weave structure and color matched the type of fiber used in common business overcoats from the late 1990s. The forensic team compared the material with descriptions of clothing worn by personnel in the financial system during that period. Archived personnel photographs showed that Sandra Morris had once owned a coat made of similar material. This detail was recorded in the report as a significant element because the fiber was embedded deep in the soil layer, in a position close to the body, and not the result of wind dispersal or natural movement. When expanding the analysis of the soil inside the grave, the forensic team noted that the soil had been disturbed unevenly, indicating hasty digging and backfilling. There were no signs of heavy objects or machinery being used. The shallow depth and irregular shape of the grave walls suggested the burial had taken place under limited light conditions or in a time-constrained environment. Additionally, the presence of several soil clumps containing coal dust was recorded, as their composition matched the dust sample collected from Harrisburg Yard rail area. Although a single definitive source could not be confirmed, this detail was preserved as part of the soil analysis profile. When determining the cause of death, the forensic report clearly stated that Elena died from traumatic brain injury caused by a blunt object. The fracture line had a width consistent with the striking surface of a handheld tool or a narrow, flat metal object. There were no indications that the victim had been dragged a long distance before burial, as the bone structure showed no deep abrasion marks from heavy friction. The condition of the body indicated that the victim was already deceased before being placed in the grave. The location where the body was found was marked on the investigative map as a critical point. The area bordering Linglestown had little nighttime traffic, with small, quiet access roads that were easy to reach by vehicle, but difficult to notice if someone stopped for a short time. The surrounding land had dense brush providing cover, and there were no surveillance cameras in the area during the late 1990s. Investigators commented that this location was consistent with a quick burial carried out by someone familiar with the area or accustomed to moving in outlying suburban zones. Once the forensic examination was complete, the report classified Elena's death as homicide. The physical evidence collected, including the skull fracture, the positioning of the body in the grave, the fiber linked to someone who worked in the financial system, and the soil composition in the grave, was documented as separate items to facilitate comparison with other personnel and evidentiary elements in the case file. The discovery of the body in the suburban area provided important information about the movement of whoever took Elena out of the city center, while also establishing a fixed point to continue tracing individuals who had potential access to both Harrisburg Yard and the land near Linglestown at the time of her disappearance. Based on the mistimed camera data, the shoe print, the witness statement at the rail yard, the soot sample, the skull trauma, and the financial documents Elena was reviewing, the investigative team reconstructed the sequence of movements on the night of September 14, 1998. The evidence shows that Elena left the building near the end of her shift, carrying a set of documents marked with discrepancies in the figures. She walked out to the parking area under low lighting and narrow pathways. The camera blind spot at the turn leading down to the parking lot was a location many technicians confirmed was completely unrecorded, creating a gap in the observation chain. Inside the unmonitored area, a woman appeared, described by the witness as having an average build, long hair tied back, and wearing dark-colored clothing. Professional data from that time showed that Sandra Morris had access to monitor the numerical discrepancies Elena had discovered. When cross-referenced with Elena's habit of arranging private meetings noted in extracted records, the investigators noted the possibility that she had agreed to meet someone to discuss the financial issue. The appearance of the woman in the parking area right after Elena left the building was considered consistent with the pattern of a short meeting as noted by Elena. According to the witness's description, this woman stood next to a dark-colored Ford Ranger pickup truck. The vehicle matched the model Helton owned in 1998. The witness stated that he saw the woman driving the vehicle in the rail yard area on the same night the incident occurred. The fact that a woman was operating the truck indicated that the vehicle may have been used not by its owner, but by someone who could have borrowed or shared it within the working departments. This aligned with data showing that Helton had previously worked with Sandra during technical troubleshooting sessions. In the camera-free area, Elena appeared facing this woman. There was no audio evidence, but the synchronized presence of the two in the blind spot when adjusted for the time offset indicated direct contact between Elena and the woman. If the meeting involved a dispute over the figures, the woman would have had the opportunity to draw Elena closer to the vehicle. A clue from the hair sample found in Elena's car showed that a man from the Morris family line had also been present inside the vehicle space, suggesting the possibility that the vehicle had been pre-arranged for coordinated use. The investigators noted that the involvement of multiple people with professional connections on the same night increased the likelihood of premeditation before approaching Elena in the parking area. Data from Harrisburg Yard showed that Elena's vehicle, or a vehicle connected to the incident, was present in that area on the same night as the soot under the car matched samples collected at the rail yard. The witness statement confirmed hearing loud arguing and a woman's scream that suddenly went silent. When cross-referencing the direction of the sound with the parked vehicle's position, the investigators recorded that the sound originated near the old warehouse where the witness had seen the Ford Ranger parked. The woman observed by the witness also appeared around the time the scream was cut off. In the forensic simulation reconstruction, Elena may have been forced into the vehicle at the parking lot by being restrained from a position hidden from the camera. Helton's role was analyzed based on his technical access rights and the indirect presence of elements linked to him. The shoe print, matching the type he had used, maintenance fabric fibers found near the argument location at the rail yard, and software system login records related to the altered transactions. The involvement of two people explained the conflicting data of the truck being owned by Helton while being driven by a woman. Evidence of Elena's resistance was recorded based on disturbed soil traces at the rail yard. The indentations indicated a struggle. The witness hearing loud arguing matched the phase of Elena's resistance. There were no signs of a body being dragged outside the rail yard, but soil marks showed a heavy impact before the body was moved from the area. The large fracture on Elena's skull matched blunt force trauma, consistent with an injury occurring during an argument in the rail yard area. Evidence from the remains showed that Elena died close to the time of the argument. There were no signs of her hands or feet being bound or of prolonged captivity. The state of decomposition and bone positioning indicated she was struck with heavy force, lost consciousness quickly, and died at or near the rail yard area. There were no signs of complex body disposal at the scene. After Elena's death, the body was removed from the rail yard and transported to a wooded area near the Linglestown boundary. This distance could have been covered by a pickup truck or a vehicle with a cargo bed. The body was buried in a shallow grave, consistent with an action carried out under limited light and time constraints. The burial method suggested only one or two people were involved, with no use of machinery. When all forensic data was overlaid on the timeline and location map, it formed a continuous movement model. Elena left the building, made contact with the woman in the parking area, was restrained at the camera blind spot, was taken to the rail yard, struggled leading to death, and then her body was moved to the area near Linglestown and buried in a shallow grave. Although each step was based on independent evidence, the alignment between physical traces, witness testimony, forensic analysis, and internal records allowed the night of September 14, 1998, to be reconstructed with a high level of detail within the scope of the currently available facts. When the forensic team completed the combined analyses, they began retrieving devices related to 1998 that were still stored in the evidence warehouse. One of them was the landline phone data and the automatic dialing equipment used by capital area transit technical staff. Although the old technology did not record location signals like modern cell phones, the system still logged the time the device was activated and the public line numbers it connected to on the night Elena disappeared. When checking the data copies, the investigators noticed that Helton's device showed signs of leaving standby mode during a time frame that overlapped with the moment Elena was approached at the parking lot. This activation occurred far enough from Helton's home to indicate that he was not at home at that time. When cross-referencing the time log with recovered data from the 1998 technical duty records, the investigators noted that Helton did not have a night shift that evening. This eliminated the possibility that he left home for work-related reasons. On the other hand, the device activation timestamp showed that he had been moving during the window that matched the camera gap and the time a witness heard arguing voices at the rail yard. This chain of data was recorded in the forensic report as a significant element proving that Helton's alibi no longer aligned with what he had previously stated. In the trace evidence analysis room, technicians re-examined photographs of the shoe impressions collected at the rail yard. Previously, the conclusion had only been that the shoe pattern was consistent with the type issued to Helton, but 2024 tread matching technology allowed reconstruction of pressure maps and groove shapes at a higher level of detail. When rescanning the original photos and measuring the zigzag grooves along the outer edge of the sole, they found that the width ratio of the grooves matched the uneven wear pattern characteristic of the shoes Helton had used while assisting the technical department. Helton had a slightly left-leaning gait, causing the outer portion of the sole to wear down earlier. The investigators retrieved the pair of Helton's shoes stored in the warehouse from the 1998 inspection and compared them directly using 3D modeling software. The simulation results displayed identical wear grooves, matching to the extent that they were considered to share the same origin. In the new report, forensics clearly stated that the shoe impression at the rail yard not only matched the type but also matched the specific wear pattern of the pair of shoes Helton was using at that time. This was evaluated as highly reliable because individual wear patterns are rarely identical by chance between two different people. When this information was entered into the case file, the investigators noted that the movement behavior at the rail yard on the night Elena disappeared very likely involved Helton's presence. While analyzing the leads, another group was assigned to review old PennDOT traffic camera data. Although most of the video had degraded or been overwritten, some segments from the night of September 14, 1998, remained in raw form. Frame restoration equipment helped extract images that could identify vehicles based on reflected light and contrast of the cargo bed. At an intersection more than 1 mile from the rail yard, a dark-colored pickup truck appeared in the frame at 9:43 p.m. Based on the bed size, taillight position, and the vehicle's profile when entering the turn, the recognition software determined a high degree of similarity to the model Helton had registered. Although the license plate could not be read, the vehicle shape matched the Ford Ranger he owned at that time. The fact that the vehicle appeared at the intersection during the same time window as Helton's phone equipment, leaving standby mode, made the information even more significant. When investigators questioned Helton about this period, he stated that he had been at home the entire evening. However, when informed about the device data and the camera images, Helton could not provide any reasonable explanation for why a vehicle identical to his own was present at that location. He answered hesitantly and changed details about his schedule, causing the statement record to become inconsistent. These evasive responses increased the level of suspicion and were noted by the investigators as signs of a changing narrative under pressure. In addition to the vehicle and device data, forensics examined the dust layer trapped in the tread grooves of the shoes that had belonged to Helton. The dust sample collected from the grooves of the old shoes was compared with the coal dust sample from Harrisburg yard rail area. The microscopic metal composition between the two samples showed many similarities, including the ratio of fractured coal particles and small oxide fragments commonly found in rail yards containing old containers. This result strengthened the likelihood that Helton's shoes had been present at the rail yard close to the time of the incident. When compiling all this data, the investigative team concluded that the alibi Helton had previously presented no longer matched the evidence. The match between the shoe impression at the rail yard and his own shoes carried highly individual characteristics. The phone equipment history showed that he left home during the exact time window of the violent act. The traffic camera image matched the profile of the vehicle he had registered. None of these elements was explained by Helton with any reasonable justification or supporting documentation. These data points were recorded in the forensic report as a sequence of information confirming Helton's presence at multiple points related to Elena's disappearance on the night of September 14, 1998. When the investigators documented the degree of match and the physical evidence, Helton was officially no longer considered an indirect suspect. His level of involvement was elevated in the file, with the assessment that his movements aligned completely with the suspected route and the physical traces connected to the location of the argument at the rail yard. This was recorded in the file as a significant shift in the evaluation of Helton's position in the Elena Marquez case. When the digital forensics team recovered the image sequence from the camera near the parking area where Elena left the building, contrast enhancement software helped clarify the figure following Elena in what had previously been a blurry segment of footage. Although the image still carried noise due to the outdated equipment, the shoulder curve, hair length, and stride rhythm all carried female characteristics. The analysis team marked these features frame by frame, measuring body proportions, torso, tilt angle, and step length. These characteristics were compatible with the witness description at the rail yard of the woman driving the Ford Ranger on the night Elena disappeared. The figure in the camera footage forced the investigators to re-examine the information provided in Sandra Morris's statement, in which she asserted she was not present in the area. At the same time, the group retrieving fixed-line telephone data from 1998 uncovered another significant point. In the log of incoming calls to Elena's desk phone on the evening of September 14, 1998, an unfamiliar number had been dialed right before she left the building. Checking the registration information for this number in old records showed it did not appear in any official listings. However, when cross-referencing the physical cable route that number traveled through, technicians noted that the line had once belonged to a sub-office of the finance department where Sandra worked. Repair records for the line indicated that the number had been decommissioned after 1998, and prior to that had been used by an employee under a temporary identity for internal calls. This led the investigators to note the possibility that the person who called Elena immediately before she left the building was directly connected to Sandra. When Sandra was invited in for questioning, she maintained that her relationship with Elena had been limited to work-related exchanges and that any previous disagreements were minor. However, forensic review of old emails revealed a chain of internal correspondence showing that Elena had repeatedly requested Sandra to explain multiple figure adjustments for which Sandra was the approving officer. In one recovered email, Elena inquired about 3 transactions showing signs of overwriting and requested supporting reconciliation documents. Sandra's reply carried a tense tone, expressing displeasure at being asked to revisit the process. This data was entered into the confrontation record, directly contradicting her statement. While investigators executed a search warrant at Sandra's residence, they discovered a jacket wrapped inside an old garment bag stored deep in a winter clothing closet. The jacket's material matched the type of fabric found in the burial pit, where Elena's remains were exhumed. When the forensic team brought the jacket into the examination room, the biological trace scanner detected a small brown mark on the inside of the sleeve. The mark was sampled and submitted for testing. DNA analysis results showed the sample matched Elena's DNA profile. This was a highly reliable trace because the location deep within the sleeve folds made incidental contamination during the search extremely unlikely. In the forensic report, technicians clearly stated that the blood spatter was consistent with high-velocity impact projection rather than casual contact. This indicated the jacket had been present at the moment of a forceful injury inflicted on Elena. When investigators questioned Sandra about the origin of the blood, she provided no consistent explanation. Her responses shifted with each question, first claiming she did not remember owning the jacket, then saying it had picked up an old stain during a warehouse cleanup. The investigators documented this inconsistency. When comparing this finding with the rail yard witness statement, the investigative team noted multiple points of alignment. The pickup truck's position matched the model Helton owned, The woman's build matched the driver observed that night, and the loud arguing, accompanied by a woman's scream, came from the direction of the warehouse. The presence of Elena's blood inside Sandra's jacket made the event model more concrete. The woman likely had close physical contact with Elena during the night of the argument. The forensic team continued evaluating Sandra's position within the financial system. Documents showed she had authority to modify figures tied to the discrepancies Elena had uncovered. This placed Sandra in a position with motive to protect those damaging financial adjustments. The emergence of telephone data, pressure-filled emails, and the blood sample in the jacket strengthened the possibility that Sandra was the person who approached Elena in the parking area. These facts were recorded independently in separate analysis tables, then cross-referenced to determine the degree of compatibility between physical traces and behavioral data. Meanwhile, Helton's position was examined from a supporting role perspective. Evidence showed he was present at the rail yard on the night of the incident. The shoe print matched the wear pattern of his issued footwear. Soot inside the shoes matched container area dust, and telephone data indicated he left home within the time frame of the argument. The connection between Sandra and Helton was demonstrated through system records showing both had rights to edit ledgers and had previously collaborated on software troubleshooting. This formed a model in which one person approached Elena while the other assisted with restraint or vehicle control. When cross-referencing the route of the pickup truck as captured in traffic cameras with the forensic simulation, investigators noted that the truck's path aligned with the route from the building to the rail yard. The witness's observation of a woman driving the vehicle was recorded as consistent with the enhanced low-quality camera footage. Combining the blood sample, internal emails, and call data, Sandra's position in the sequence of events was identified as the person who directly approached Elena. In the final summary table of the forensic analysis phase, the investigators recorded Sandra Morris as the individual who carried out the act causing fatal injury to Elena, while Helton held a supporting role involving the vehicle, presence at the rail yard, and indirect actions related to moving Elena away from the parking area. Based on these findings, the case file evaluation of the two individuals' roles was updated, placing Sandra in the position of the primary perpetrator inflicting direct trauma, and Helton as an accomplice providing support during the events of the night of September 14, 1998. When the investigative team compiled all the financial data, they reconstructed the transaction chain, showing that approximately $70,000 had been manipulated through multiple layers of overrides to conceal the trail. All the editing entries appeared under two accounts, with data modification privileges: Helton's technical account and Sandra Morris's internal approval account. The forensic auditors reviewed each transaction, marking the time of changes, access codes, and computer parameters, creating a clear picture of the fraud mechanism. The data showed that small amounts were aggregated in 3 batches, coinciding with the weeks when Elena had noted suspicions in her work notebook. In Elena's notes, the investigators found the special symbols she typically used to flag items that needed to be reported to superiors. 3 of these symbols appeared precisely on the group of transactions that forensics identified as having been edited without authorization. This proved that Elena had recognized the discrepancies before she disappeared. One page of notes even contained the line, "Need to confirm approving party," which matched the time when Elena scheduled a private meeting to discuss the figures on the evening of September 14, 1998. Thus, Elena had sufficient information to understand that the discrepancies were not technical errors but originated from individuals with data editing privileges, namely Morris or Helton. When forensics reviewed recovered internal emails from backup tapes, they found that Elena had requested Sandra to submit reconciliation documents 3 times within a 2-week period. The reply emails showed Sandra expressing irritation, citing system errors or the need for more time. The investigators clearly noted that this frequency of exchanges demonstrated Elena was getting close to finalizing her discrepancy report. Her work placed Morris at risk of a full audit, which could uncover the entire stream of manipulated funds. With $70,000 involved, losing control of the information represented a major threat to anyone carrying out the fraud. When questioned, Sandra claimed she did not realize how seriously Elena intended to pursue an internal investigation. However, Forensics recovered a draft report by Elena from the digital trash, showing that she had begun compiling evidence to submit to management. This gave Sandra's actions a concrete context: fear of exposure and the risk of legal liability. One investigator noted in the report that the extent of the data alterations was inconsistent with accidental error and instead reflected deliberate concealment. With Elena as the person who discovered it, Sandra's motive to protect herself became evident. Helton's role was also explained by the system data. His access logs appeared at times when Sandra was not present in the building. This indicated that the data editing actions were carried out by two people capable of dividing the tasks, one with approval authority and one with technical processing rights. Helton's involvement showed he was part of the process to conceal the money flow, even though direct evidence did not specify who ultimately benefited. This data placed Helton in a position with motives similar to Sandra's: fear of being traced through electronic signatures and software access rights. The investigative team documented the pattern of actions leading up to the night of September 14, 1998. Elena discovered irregular figures, requested clarification, and prepared an internal report. If the report had been submitted, the audit process would have expanded, exposing the manipulated transactions and placing responsibility on the two individuals with access privileges. Sandra had natural access to Elena because they were in the same department, making it plausible that she lured Elena to a meeting to explain the figures. In the phone data, the last call to Elena before she left the building matched the line once assigned to the sub-office where Sandra worked. This reinforced the likelihood that Sandra was the one who arranged to meet Elena. When forensics reconstructed the events in the parking lot, the blurry camera data showed Elena meeting a woman before disappearing. A witness at the rail yard also saw a woman driving the Ford Ranger. The fact that a fiber from Sandra's coat appeared in the grave where Elena's body was found proved close physical contact between the two women at the time violence occurred. These elements combined into a pattern indicating Sandra had a direct role in restraining and injuring Elena. Regarding Helton, forensics proved he was moving outside his home during the time frame of the argument at the rail yard. The shoe impression matched his individual wear pattern, and the coal dust on his shoes matched the composition found at the rail yard, making his presence at the scene highly certain. The fact that he owned a vehicle matching the one the witness described further supported his involvement. The possibility that Helton assisted Sandra by driving the vehicle, facilitating Elena's transport, or handling the scene was recorded in the report. By cross-referencing all the data, the investigators concluded that financial motive was the core factor. The $70,000 had been siphoned from the internal system in multiple stages, and only two people had the authority to do so: Sandra and Helton. Elena was the only person who detected the wrongdoing and had begun preparing to submit a report to superiors. This placed Sandra in a high-risk position both professionally and legally. Looking at the timeline, the investigative team determined that arranging to meet Elena on the evening of September 14, 1998, may have been intended to pressure her into dropping the investigation. However, the physical evidence from the rail yard showed that the conversation became heated and then turned violent. The blow to Elena's skull, as determined by forensics, was caused by a blunt object, consistent with impulsive behavior in an uncontrolled situation. Helton played a supporting role after the incident by handling the vehicle, moving the body, and disposing of it in the area bordering Linglestown. These actions reflected coordination between the two to minimize the risk of being traced while concealing their connection to the embezzled funds. In the analysis file, the investigators noted that this motive fully satisfied all elements. There was an interest to protect, a risk of exposure, actions taken to silence the person who could report it, and coordination to obscure the evidence trail. At the conclusion of the forensic report, the investigative team determined that the motive for the violence against Elena was to conceal financial fraud amounting to $70,000 and to avoid legal liability. The pattern of coordination between Sandra Morris and Helton was clearly demonstrated through both financial data and crime scene evidence, creating a unified assessment of the motive in the case. When the complete forensic report was finalized and the summary table of the two suspects' behaviors was entered into the official case file, the Dauphin County District Attorney submitted an application for arrest warrants to the court. The judge at the Dauphin County Courthouse reviewed the evidence, which included DNA, blood samples, telephone data, financial documents, shoe print matches, and witness statements. After a closed-door review that lasted several hours, arrest warrants were signed for Sandra Morris and Mark Helton, accompanied by a list of charges including homicide, kidnapping, and evidence tampering. The warrants were immediately forwarded to law enforcement agencies in multiple states because both suspects no longer resided in the Harrisburg area. Sandra Morris was located living in Cleveland, Ohio, where she worked as an accountant for a small company that supplied office equipment. The U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force coordinated with Cleveland police to surveil her workplace and residence for 2 days before making the arrest. When Sandra stepped out the back door of the office building, agents immediately approached and instructed her to place her hands behind her head. She appeared surprised and did not resist, but her expression changed noticeably when she was informed of the arrest warrant related to the 1998 case. At the moment she was handcuffed, Sandra asked why something from so long ago is being brought up again, and that question was recorded by an on-scene technician in the report as a noteworthy psychological reaction. Meanwhile, the arrest of Helton took place in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Helton was working part-time at an electronics repair shop. The investigative team used 2025 smartphone data to determine that Helton had made multiple contacts with a Morris family member living in Ohio. The same family branch linked to the hair sample found in Elena's car. This ongoing communication appeared in a short window right before forensic teams recollected evidence. When Lancaster police approached, Helton showed visible anxiety, repeatedly asking, "What's going on?" but without strong physical resistance. Still, his demeanor was noted as more tense than Sandra's at the time of arrest. Both suspects were transported to the Dauphin County Detention Center. Interrogations were conducted separately, with participation from investigators who had been working the case for many months. In the interview room, Sandra sat facing the evidence board. In front of her were photographs of the jacket stained with Elena's blood, DNA results, enhanced camera footage, and the 1998 financial transaction report. When the investigator read aloud the figure of $70,000 in altered entries, Sandra could no longer maintain the calm she had shown at the time of arrest. She looked at the reconstructed photo of Elena's remains from the forensic file and began to tremble slightly. The investigator questioned her about the final call to Elena's desk phone, the origin of the jacket found in her home, her presence at the rail yard, and the reason she appeared in the enhanced blurry camera footage near the parking area on the night of September 14, 1998. At first, Sandra continued to deny any involvement, but when the investigator slid the blood spatter analysis report in front of her and explained how the DNA sample had been extracted from the inner sleeve folds, her expression changed completely. The interrogation team recorded that just a few minutes later, she took a deep breath and requested to speak about what actually happened. In her statement, Sandra admitted that she had called Elena on the afternoon of September 14th to arrange a meeting, hoping to explain the figures again, before Elena submitted her report. She said the original intent was to persuade Elena to delay the report, not to attack her. When she met Elena in the parking area, the conversation grew heated because Elena firmly maintained her position and stated she would submit the report the very next day. Sandra claimed she grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her into the camera blind spot simply to keep persuading her. But Elena reacted more forcefully than expected. When they reached the rail yard, the argument escalated, and the use of a blunt object was an impulsive reaction. Sandra stated that she had no intention of ending Elena's life, and that the situation spiraled out of control. When asked about Helton's role, Sandra stated that he assisted in getting Elena into the vehicle when she resisted, and that he was the one who drove the truck to dispose of the body. She said she did not know what Helton did afterward, only that he took care of the rest. This statement aligned with the shoe print evidence, traffic camera data, and Helton's telephone records from the night of the incident. In the other interview room, Helton remained defensive. When asked about his movements on the night of September 14, 1998, he refused to answer or claimed he did not remember clearly. When the investigator presented the three-dimensional shoe print match and the comparison of soot embedded in the sole, Helton looked down at the table but offered no explanation. However, upon learning that Sandra had given a full statement, he began to change his account, blaming Sandra as the one giving orders and claiming he only followed her instructions because he feared losing his job. His rapid shift in story was documented as a sign of lack of credibility. No evidence supported his claim of being coerced. At the conclusion of the initial interrogation sessions, the district attorney announced the decision to prosecute both Sandra Morris and Mark Helton on multiple counts: aggravated homicide, kidnapping based on the component of forcibly moving the victim from a place of safety, and evidence tampering related to the relocation of the body, as well as alterations to evidence in the vehicle and storage areas. The complete charging package was forwarded to the Dauphin County Court to schedule the preliminary hearing. In the final report of the arrest day, the investigators recorded that both suspects were now squarely within the scope of direct prosecution, with their statements and physical evidence forming a body of documentation strong enough to sustain the highest level of criminal charges under Pennsylvania law. In the large courtroom of the Dauphin County Courthouse, the trial of Sandra Morris and Mark Helton drew attention from local media and many people who had followed the Elena Marquez disappearance case for more than 2 decades. Additional seating was arranged for the public, but many people still had to stand along the hallway walls. When Sandra and Helton were let in, both maintained tense expressions and avoided looking directly at the jury. The prosecutor began with a presentation of the forensic evidence organized in chronological order. First came the timeline reconstructing Elena's movements on the night of September 14, 1998, leaving the building, passing through the camera blind spot, contact with a woman at the parking lot, and the appearance of the Ford Ranger at the rail yard according to the witness. The prosecution displayed restored traffic camera video, enhanced images from the parking lot camera, and a coordinated map of the timestamps recorded from devices linked to Helton. Placing these pieces of data side by side formed a continuous chain of movement, making it easy for the jury to follow the prosecution's argument. Next, the prosecution presented the DNA results. The hair sample in Elena's car showed a connection to the Morris family. The blood sample found inside the coat at Sandra's home matched Elena's DNA profile completely. The prosecutor explained that the location of the bloodstains in the folds of the coat indicated close contact during a violent situation. The result chart was displayed directly in front of the jury, with forensic technicians pointing out the spatter patterns caused by a single forceful blow. This evidence reinforced the theory that Sandra was present at the moment Elena received the fatal injury. The prosecution then presented the shoe impression evidence. Three-dimensional reconstructions of the shoe prints collected at the rail yard appeared on the large screen, showing the distinctive sole groove pattern that matched the pair of shoes issued to Helton. The forensic specialist described the process of measuring groove width, the left-leaning uneven wear, and the points of individual level correspondence. The degree of compatibility between the seen impressions and the original shoes was rated as very high, and the prosecutor emphasized that the probability of random coincidence was extremely low. Following the shoe evidence, the prosecution introduced the analysis of the coal dust recovered from the undercarriage of Elena's car. The spectral chart was displayed, showing that the dust composition matched samples collected at Harrisburg yard rail area. This proved that Elena's car had been present at the location where a witness heard arguing and a woman scream. When combined with the movement history of the Ford Ranger, the prosecutor pointed out that the vehicle's appearance on traffic camera footage aligned exactly with the route from the building to the rail yard. Another critical part of the argument was the financial motive. The prosecution presented the reconstructed $70,000 fraud file. Charts displayed the overwritten transactions, access logs from Sandra's and Helton's accounts, and Elena's notes on numerical discrepancies. The prosecutor explained that Elena had gathered enough data to file an internal report, and Sandra's actions to delay or prevent the reporting became clearer when viewed alongside the tense email exchanges between the two women. The numbers and charts were presented item by item so the jury could follow, ensuring transparency in the chain of reasoning. When it came to witness testimony, the man who had worked at the rail yard took the stand. He recounted hearing the argument and a woman scream on the night of September 14, 1998, along with seeing a dark-colored Ford Ranger parked near an old storage shed. He described the woman stepping down from the cab and opening the passenger door. His testimony was supported by the prosecution with a scene reconstruction image and a map showing his position when he heard the sounds. The jury listened intently to every detail of his description. Sandra's defense attorney attempted to argue that Elena's death could have been an accident during an argument. They claimed the skull fracture might have resulted from a fall onto a hard object at the rail yard. However, the forensic pathologist affirmed that the fracture showed a radiating pattern characteristic of a direct blow with a blunt object and was inconsistent with a fall mechanism. Helton's defense attorney argued that his client had only appeared at the scene after Elena was already deceased and had acted under pressure from Sandra. But the prosecution countered with the phone device data showing that Helton left his home at the exact time Elena was approached and was present at the rail yard, along with the shoe impression matching the location of the struggle. In the final summation, the prosecution reconstructed the sequence of events with forensic detail: the phone call arranging the meeting, the appearance of a woman in the camera blind spot, Elena being forced to move, the argument at the rail yard, the fatal head injury, and the disposal of the body near Linglestown. On the large screen, each piece of evidence was placed next to its corresponding physical proof, forming a unified pattern. The jury was instructed to consider the entire chain of evidence under the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. After closing arguments concluded, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate. Time passed in a tense silence. Less than 6 hours later, they returned to the courtroom. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict in a firm voice. Sandra Morris was found guilty of murder in the first degree, along with charges of kidnapping and evidence tampering. Mark Helton was found guilty as an active accomplice, responsible for actions that facilitated the full commission of the crime. When the verdict was finished, the courtroom remained silent for a few seconds before the sound of pens signing the record echoed, closing the trial with a clear conclusion based on all the evidence presented in court. In the courtroom of the Dauphin County Courthouse, the atmosphere grew heavy as the judge entered and asked everyone to rise. The two defendants sat silently at the defense table, each with their attorney seated beside them, but no one still had enough confidence to maintain a calm posture. After confirming that the jury had completed its duty, the judge moved to the sentencing phase, based on the guilty verdict that the jury had unanimously reached. The judge called Sandra Morris first. She stood up, her hands clenched tightly together. In the court record, her conduct was determined to be intentional homicide, with clear motive and preparatory actions to approach the victim on the very evening Elena disappeared. After considering all aggravating factors, especially the severity of the assault and the years-long cover-up process, the judge sentenced her to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for the first 35 years. The sentence was read in a steady, straightforward voice, and not a single movement on the judge's face showed any wavering. Sandra listened to the entire sentence staring down at the floor, showing no strong reaction but breathing noticeably heavier when the handcuffs were placed back on her wrists. Next came the sentencing of Mark Helton. The judge emphasized Helton's role in assisting Sandra, including driving the vehicle, being present at the rail yard during the argument, and participating in moving the body. These actions were classified as active aiding in a crime with severe consequences. Based on the level of involvement, Helton was sentenced to 42 years in prison, including lesser-included offenses, unlawful restraint of the victim, and handling evidence to conceal the scene. When he heard the sentence, Helton looked straight ahead but his eyes clouded over. His attorney placed a hand on his client's shoulder in a reassuring gesture, but Helton did not respond. During the expanded investigation, investigators discovered the indirect involvement of Sandra's brother, who had once helped transport some internal documents in 1998, without knowing they were evidence related to the disappearance. However, after review, the court determined that he clearly knew the action was intended to conceal Sandra's responsibility when authorities inquired about transaction copies. Therefore, the judge sentenced him to 4 years in prison for the offense of aiding in the concealment of evidence, a lesser charge compared to the two main defendants, but still sufficient to impose legal responsibility for his conduct. When the sentences were fully pronounced, the judge moved to the court's findings. In this section, the court stated clearly that the Elena Marquez case dragged on for many years, not only because of the complexity of the chain of events, but also due to limitations in forensic technology and investigative processes of the late 1990s. The judge acknowledged the progress of Pennsylvania forensics, particularly the genealogical DNA testing program, microanalysis, and trace reconstruction modeling, which helped resolve long-standing cold cases. These points were entered into the court record as the result of collaboration between forensic science and law enforcement. The prosecutor presented the official closing statement, read before the court, which stated, "Elena Marquez lost her life because she fulfilled her duty within the financial system she served. She died protecting the truth." The statement was entered into the record as the final recognition of the motive and cause of Elena's death. No further commentary, just a respectful sentence, exactly as the court intended to close the file. In the courtroom, silence stretched on as investigators sat watching the sentencing. Those who had spent years reviewing thousands of pages of files, handling long-forgotten samples, and reconstructing the sequence of events, never took their eyes off the two handcuffed defendants being led out. Some spectators in the gallery clenched their fists when Sandra's sentence was announced, clearly feeling the weight of the legal decision after more than 2 decades of waiting. When the hearing concluded, the Elena Marquez case file was announced to be incorporated into teaching and research materials as a prominent case study of Pennsylvania forensics, illustrating how modern technology can revive cases once thought lost to time. The State Department of Justice final report explicitly stated that this case demonstrates the importance of evidence preservation, as many samples only revealed their value more than 20 years after collection. Just before declaring the session closed, the judge emphasized in the record that the Elena Marquez case leaves a major lesson. Investigative errors in the late 1990s caused law enforcement to miss many critical details. Misrecording the shoe print location, failing to compare shoe samples, not analyzing fabric fragments, and not fully exploiting financial data caused the case to stall for years. These observations were included in the official conclusion, as both a warning and a strong reminder of the responsibility of modern investigative forces. When the hearing ended, the court entered the final line into the record: the Elena Marquez file is closed with a clear verdict, based on complete evidence and a lawful trial process. No further disputes, no remaining legal gaps to examine. The file pages were closed, marking the end of a 27-year case that left a deep mark on the field of forensics and in the memory of the Harrisburg community. The story of Elena Marquez is not just a criminal file closed after 27 years, but also a mirror reflecting the challenges in American life today, where transparency, accountability, and protection of whistleblowers have become the foundation of a just society. Elena lost her life because she dared confront $70,000 in financial wrongdoing within the system she served, a detail that reminds us that doing the right thing is not always safe. Her resolute actions in demanding data reconciliation, keeping notes, and scheduling reports demonstrated the power of integrity. Yet her death also exposed a vulnerability. Those who speak up are often left without adequate protection. In today's United States, when whistleblowers in finance, healthcare, education, or technology still face retaliation risks, Elena's story reminds us that the system is only as strong as the protection given to those who defend the truth. The case also shows the value of modern technology in pursuing justice. DNA from Morris's old jacket, coal dust at the Harrisburg rail yard, the misrecorded shoe print from 1998, all became crucial pieces, thanks to forensics in 2024-2025. The lesson here is not just for investigators, but for the public. Small details, sometimes overlooked, can hold the power to reveal truth if they are preserved and respected. Most importantly, the story reminds Americans that justice does not always arrive quickly, but persistence, from the victim's family, investigators, and the community, can produce results. Protect the truth, preserve data, respect procedure, and never ignore unusual signals. Justice may be slow, but it is never futile when society relentlessly pursues it. If you believe stories like the Elena Marquez case need to keep being told to remind us of the value of truth, Please hit subscribe to join the channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue seeking justice for stories still waiting to be illuminated.